Chapter 4. The noise on the stage receded. In its place she heard birdsong, the hum of distant traffic. In her mind's eye, the darkness of the theater was replaced by remembered light. 3 years ago, the park, the ball, their laughter, disaster on its way like lightning from a blue sky. Jacob, grinning as he ran towards her, the bat's weight, dry and wooden in her hand, the strike, the triumph of it, dancing with delight. The distant crash. How they ran, hearts thudding, and then the creature on the bridge. She rubbed her fingers into her eyes, but even that terrible day, was it truly the beginning? For the first 13 years of her life, Kitty had remained unaware of the exact nature of the magician's rule. Or perhaps she was not consciously aware of it, for looking back she realized that doubts and intuitions had managed to negotiate their way into her mind. The magicians had long been at the zenith of their power, and no one could remember a time when this wasn't so. For the most part, they kept themselves removed from the experience of the ordinary commoner, remaining in the center of the city and in the suburbs, where broad, leafy boulevards idled between secretive villas. What lay between was left to everyone else. Streets clogged with small shops, waste ground, the factories, and brickworks. Magicians passed through occasionally in their great black cars, but otherwise their presence was mainly felt in the vigilant spheres floating randomly above the streets. The spheres keep us safe, Kitty's father told her one evening, after a large red orb had silently accompanied her home from school. Don't be frightened of them. If you're a good girl, they'll do no harm. It's only bad men, thieves and spies who need to be afraid. But Kitty had been frightened. After that, livid, glowing spheres often pursued her in her dreams. Her parents were visited by no such fears. Neither of them was overtly imaginative, but they were robustly conscious of the greatness of London, of their own small place in it. They took for granted the superiority of the magicians and fully accepted the unchanging nature of their rule. Indeed, they found it reassuring. "I'd lay down my life for the Prime Minister," her father used to say. "He's a great man."
"He keeps the Czechs where they belong,"
her mother said.
"Without him, we'd have the hussars marching down Clapham High Road, and you wouldn't want that, dear, would you?"
Kitty supposed not. They had lived, the three of them, in a terrace house in the South London suburb of Balham. It was a small home, with a sitting room and a kitchen downstairs and a tiny bathroom out back. Upstairs was a little landing and 2 bedrooms, Kitty's parents' and her own. A long, thin mirror stood on the landing, before which, on weekday mornings, the whole family stood in turn, brushing hair and arranging their clothes. Her father, in particular, fiddled endlessly with his tie. Kitty could never understand why he kept on tying and untying it, kept on weaving the strip of fabric, in, up, round, and out, since the variations between each attempt were practically microscopic. "Appearances are very important, Kitty," he would say, surveying the umpteenth knot with furrowed brow. "In my job, you've only got one chance to impress." Kitty's father was a tall, wiry man, stubborn of outlook and blunt of speech. He was shop floor manager in a large department store in central London, and very proud of this responsibility. He supervised the leather section, a broad, low-ceilinged hall, dimly lit by orange lights and filled with expensive bags and briefcases made from cured animal skin. The leather goods were luxury items, which meant that the vast majority of customers were magicians. Kitty had visited the shop once or twice, and the darkly overpowering smell of the processed leather always made her head spin. "Stay out of the magician's way," her father said. "They're very important people, and they don't like anyone getting under their feet. Even pretty little girls like you."
How do I know who's a magician?
Kitty asked. She was 7 at the time and wasn't sure. "They're always well-dressed. Their faces are stern and wise, and sometimes they have fine walking sticks. They wear expensive scents, but sometimes you can still catch hints of their magic, strange incenses, odd chemicals. But if you smell that, the chances are you'll be too close. Stay out of their way." Kitty had promised faithfully. She scampered to far corners whenever customers entered the leather hall and watched them with wide, curious eyes. Her father's tips did not help much. Everyone visiting the store seemed well-dressed. Many carried sticks, and the stench of leather masked any unusual scents. But she soon began to pick out the magicians by other clues. A certain hardness in the visitors' eyes, their air of cool command. Above all, a sudden stiffening in her father's manner. He always seemed awkward when talking with them, his suit newly wrinkled with anxiety, his tie nervously askew. He gave little bobs and bows of agreement as they spoke. These signs were very subtle, but they were enough for Kitty, and they disconcerted and even distressed her, though she hardly knew the reason why. Kitty's mother worked as a receptionist at Palmer's Quill Bureau, a long-established firm hidden amongst the many bookbinders and parchment makers of South London. The bureau provided special quill pens for the magicians to use in their conjurations. Quills were messy, slow, and difficult to write with, and fewer magicians than ever bothered to use them. The staff at Palmer's used bureaus instead. The job allowed Kitty's mother glimpses of the magicians themselves, since occasionally one would visit the bureau to inspect a new consignment of pens. She found their proximity thrilling. "She was so glamorous," she would say. "Her clothes were the finest red gold taffeta. I'm sure they came from Byzantium itself. And she was so imperious, too. When she snapped her fingers, everyone jumped like crickets to do her bidding."
Sounds rather rude to me,
Kitty said. "You're so very young, love," her mother said. "No, she was a great woman." One day, when Kitty was 10 years old, she came home from school to find her mother sitting tearfully in the kitchen.
"Mom, what's the matter?"
"It's nothing. Well, what am I saying? I am hurt a little, Kitty. I'm afraid that I have been made redundant. Oh, dear. What are we going to tell your father?" Kitty sat her mother down, made her a pot of tea, and brought her a biscuit. Over much snuffling, sipping, and sighing, the truth came out. Old Mr. Palmer had retired. His firm had been acquired by a trio of magicians who disliked having ordinary commoners on their staff. They had brought in new personnel and sacked half of the original employees, including Kitty's mother.
"But they can't do that."
Kitty had protested.
"Of course they can. It's their right. They protect the country, make us the greatest nation in the world. They have many privileges."
Her mother dabbed at her eyes and took another slurp of tea.
"But even so, it is a little hurtful, after so many years."
Hurtful or not, that was the last day that Kitty's mother worked at Palmer's. A few weeks later, her friend, Mrs. Hiernick, who had also been dismissed, got her a job as a cleaner in a printing works, and life resumed in structured course. But Kitty didn't forget. Kitty's parents were avid readers of the Times newspaper, which brought daily news of the Army's latest victories. For years, it seemed the wars had been going well. The Empire's territories expanded by the season, and the world's wealth was flowing back into the capital. But this success came at a price, and the paper continually advised all readers to be on the lookout for spies and saboteurs from enemy states who might be living in an ordinary neighborhood, while all the time quietly working on wicked plots to destabilize the nation.
You keep your eyes open, Kitty, her mother advised. No one takes heed of a girl like you. You never know. You might see something.
Especially around here, her father added sourly, in Balham. The area where Kitty lived was famous for its Czech community, which was long established. The high street had several little borscht cafes, marked by their thick net curtains and colorful flower pots on the sills. Tanned old gentlemen with drooping white mustaches played chess and skittles in the streets outside the bars, and many of the local firms were owned by the grandchildren of the émigrés who had come to England back in Gladstone's time. Flourishing through the area it contained several important printing firms, including the noted Hirnik and Sons. Its strong European identity drew the constant attention of the night police. As she grew older, Kitty became used to witnessing daytime raids, with patrols of gray uniformed officers breaking down doors and throwing belongings into the streets. Sometimes young men were taken away in vans. On other occasions, the families were left intact, to piece together the wreckage of their homes. Kitty always found these scenes upsetting, despite her father's reassurances. The police must maintain a presence, he insisted. Keep troublemakers on their toes. Believe me, Kitty, they wouldn't act without good intelligence on the matter.
But, Dad, those were friends of Mr. Hirnik.
A grunt. He should pick his pals more carefully then, shouldn't he? Kitty's father was, in fact, always civil to Mr. Hirnik, whose wife had, after all, got Kitty's mother a new job. The Hirniks were a prominent local family, whose business was patronized by many magicians. Their printing works occupied a large site close to Kitty's house and provided employment for many people of the area. Despite this, the Hirniks never seemed especially well off. They lived in a big, sprawling, run-down house set a little back from the road, behind an overgrown garden of long grass and laurel bushes. In time, Kitty came to know it well, thanks to her friendship with Jacob, the youngest of the Hirnik sons. Kitty was tall for her age, and growing taller, slender beneath her baggy school jersey and wide-legged trousers. Stronger than she looked, too. More than one boy had regretted a facetious comment to her face. Kitty did not waste words when a punch would do. Her hair was dark brown, veering to black, and straight, except at the end, where it had a tendency to curl in an unruly fashion. She wore it shorter than the other girls, midway down her neck. Kitty had dark eyes and heavy black brows. Her face openly reflected her opinions, and since to Kitty opinions came thick and fast, her eyebrows and mouth were in constant motion.
Your face is never the same twice,
Jacob had said.
Yeah, that's a compliment,
he added hastily, when Kitty glowered at him. They sat together in the same classrooms for several years, learning what they could from the mixed bag of disciplines on offer to the common children. Crafts were encouraged, since their future lay in the factories and workshops of the city. They learned pottery, woodcutting, metalwork, and simple mathematics. Technical drawings, needlepoint, and cookery were also taught, and for those like Kitty who enjoyed words, reading and writing were on offer too, with the proviso that this skill would one day be properly employed, perhaps in a secretarial career. Daily, they received instruction in the glorious development of the British state. Kitty enjoyed these lessons, which featured many stories of magic and far-off lands, but couldn't help sensing certain limitations in what they were being taught. Often she would put up her hand.
Yes, Kitty, what is it this time?
Her teacher's tones often displayed a slight weariness, which they did their best to disguise.
Please, sir, tell us more about the government that Mr. Gladstone overthrew. You said it had a parliament already. We've got a parliament now. So why was the old one so wicked? Well, Kitty, if you'd been listening properly, you'd have heard me say that the old parliament was not wicked so much as weak. It was run by ordinary people, like you and me, who did not have any magical powers. Imagine that. Of course, that meant that they were constantly getting harassed by other, stronger countries, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Now, which was the most dangerous foreign nation in those days? Let me see now. Jacob? Don't know, sir. Speak up, boy. Don't mumble. Well, I'm surprised to hear you say that, Jacob. You of all people. It was the Holy Roman Empire, of course. Your ancestors. The Czech emperor ruled most of Europe from his castle in Prague. He was so fat, he sat on a wheeled throne of steel and gold, and was pulled about the corridors by a single bone-white ox. When he wished to leave the castle, they had to lower him out by reinforced pulley. He kept an aviary of parakeets, and shot a different-colored one each night for his supper. Yes, you may well be disgusted, children. That was the kind of man who ruled Europe in those days, and our old parliament was helpless against him. He governed a terrible assembly of magicians who were wicked and corrupt, and whose leader, Hans Meyrink, is said to have been a vampire. Their soldiers rampaged. Yes, Kitty. What is it now? Well, sir, if the old parliament was so incompetent, how come the fat emperor never invaded Britain? Because he didn't, did he, sir? And why? I can only answer one question at a time, Kitty. I'm not a magician. Britain was lucky, that's all. Prague was always slow to act. The emperor spent much of his time drinking beer and engaging in terrible debauchery. But he would have turned his evil gaze to London eventually, believe you me. Fortunately for us, there were a few magicians in London in those days, to whom the poor, powerless ministers sometimes came for advice. And one of them was Mr. Gladstone. He saw the dangers of our situation and decided on a preemptive strike. Can you remember what he did, children? Yes, Sylvester? He persuaded the ministers to hand over control to him, sir. He went in to see them one evening and talked so cleverly that they elected him prime minister there and then. That's right. Good boy, Sylvester. You'll get a star. Yes, it was the night of the Long Council. After a lengthy debate in Parliament, Gladstone's eloquence won the day, and the ministers unanimously resigned in his favor. He organized a defensive attack on Prague the following year, and overthrew the emperor. Yes, Abigail? Did he free the parakeets, sir? I'm sure he did. Gladstone was a very kind man. He was sober and moderate in all his tastes, and wore the same starched shirt each day, except on Sundays, when his mother cleaned it for him. After that, London's power increased, while Prague's diminished. And, as Jacob might realize, if he wasn't slumped so rudely in his seat, that was when many Czech citizens, like his family, immigrated to Britain. Many of Prague's best magicians came too, and helped us create the modern state. Now, perhaps, but I thought you said the Czech magicians were all wicked and corrupt, sir. Well, I expect all the wicked ones were killed, don't you, Kitty? The others were just misguided and saw the error of their ways. Now, there's the bell. Lunchtime. And no, Kitty, I'm not going to answer any more questions just now. Everyone stand up, put your chairs under your desks, and please leave quietly.
After such discussions in school, Jacob was frequently morose, but his moodiness rarely lasted long. He was a cheerful and energetic soul, slight and dark-haired, with an open, impudent face. He liked games, and from an early age spent many hours with Kitty, playing in the long grass of his parents' garden. They kicked footballs, practiced archery, improvised cricket, and generally kept out of the way of his large and boisterous family. Nominally, Mr. Hirnick was the head of the household, but in practice he, like everyone else, was dominated by his wife, Mrs. Hirnick. A bustling bundle of maternal energy, all broad shoulders and capacious bosom, she sailed around the house like a galleon blown by an erratic wind, forever uttering raucous whoops of laughter or calling out Czech curses after her 4 unruly sons. Jacob's older brothers, Karel, Robert, and Alfred, had all inherited their mother's imposing physique and their size, strength, and deep resounding voices always awed Kitty into silence whenever they came near. Mr. Hirnick was like Jacob, small and slight, but with a leathery skin that reminded Kitty of a shriveled apple's. He smoked a curved rowanwood pipe that left wreaths of sweet smoke hanging around the house and garden. Jacob was very proud of his father.
He's brilliant,
he told Kitty, as they rested under a tree after a game of fives against the side wall of the house.
No one else can do what he does with parchment and leather. You should see the miniature spell pamphlets he's been working on lately. They're embossed in gold filigree in the old Prague style, but reduced to the tiniest scale. He works in little outlines of animals and flowers in perfect detail, then embeds tiny pieces of ivory and precious stones inside. Only Dad can do stuff like that. They must cost a fortune when he's finished,
Kitty said. Jacob spat out a grass shoot he was chewing.
You're joking, of course,
he said flatly.
The magicians don't pay him what they should. Never do. He can barely keep the factory working. Look at all that.
He nodded up at the body of the house, with its slate skew-whiff on the roof, the shutters crooked and ingrained with dirt, the paint peeling on the veranda door.
Think we should be living in a place like this? Come off it. It's a lot bigger than my house,
Kitty observed.
Hirnick's is the second biggest printers in London,
Jacob said.
Only Yaroslav's is bigger, and they just churn stuff out. Ordinary leather bindings, annual almanacs and indexes. Nothing special. It's us who deal in the delicate work, the real craft. That's why so many magicians come to us when they want their best books bound and personalized. They love the unique, luxurious touch. Last week, Dad finished a cover. It had a pentacle fashioned in tiny diamonds on the front. Ludicrous. But there you go. That's what the woman wanted. Why don't the magicians pay your dad properly? You'd think they'd worry he'd stop doing everything so well. Make it lousy quality. My dad's too proud for that. But the real point is they've got him over a barrel. He's gotta behave, or they'll close us down. Give the business to someone else. We're Czechs, remember? Suspicious customers. Can't be trusted. Even though the Hirnicks have been in London for 150 years. What?
Kitty was outraged.
That's ridiculous. Of course they trust you. They'd throw you out of the country otherwise. They tolerate us because they need our skill. But what with all the trouble on the continent, they watch us all the time, in case we're in league with spies. There's a permanent search sphere operating in Dad's factory, for instance, and Karel and Robert are always being followed. We've had 4 police raids in the last 2 years. The last time they turned the house upside down. Grandmama was taking a bath. They dumped her out in the street in her old tin tub. How awful!
Kitty threw the cricket ball high into the air and caught it in an outstretched palm.
Well, that's magicians for you. We hate them, but what can you do? What's the matter? You're twisting your lip. That means something's bothering you.
Kitty untwisted her lip hurriedly.
I was just thinking you hate the magicians, but your whole family supports them. Your dad, your brothers working in his workshop? Everything you make goes to them, one way or another. And yet they treat you so badly. It doesn't seem right. Why doesn't your family do something else?
Jacob grinned ruefully.
My dad's got a saying. The safest place to swim is right behind the shark. We make the magicians beautiful things, and that makes them happy. It means they keep off our backs. Just about. If we didn't do that, what would happen? They'd be on us in a flash. You're frowning again.
Kitty was not sure she approved.
But if you don't like the magicians, you shouldn't cooperate with them,
she persisted.
It's morally wrong. What?
Jacob kicked out at her leg with genuine irritation.
Don't give me that. Your parents cooperate with them. Everyone does. There's no alternative, is there? If you don't, the police, or something worse, pays a visit in the night and spirits you away. There's no alternative to cooperation. Is there? Is there? Suppose not. No, there isn't. Not unless you want to end up dead.